Nau mai, hoki mai, kia ora fault. Ko Duncan Greive toku ingoa. My guests today are James Hurman and Julie Gill, who are the co-founders of a new media platform called Caffeine Daily. As we record it, it's 8 weeks and 1 day old, so this thing is very, very fresh. But already I think I think it's one of the most interesting and kind of well-conceived new media properties of the year, not without its complexities, and our conversation gets into that, but certainly like it's just got a coherence and a vision that is lacking in some very well-established media properties, let alone kind of new babies coming into the world. It's very much laser-focused on startups, the startup community, which, is obviously something that didn't really exist. The term might not have been even understood 20 years ago. Now, the startups that were born 20 years ago are the biggest companies in the world, and we sort of understand in a very fundamental way that high-growth, venture capital-funded companies with huge global ambitions, a lot of them fail, but the ones that succeed end up changing our lives and our realities, for better or for worse. And, I think that New Zealand has had a number of the sort of iconic New Zealand businesses of the last 20 years, the likes of Trade Me, Xero, some of which aren't as prominent but are massively successful, like Pushpay. There has been just a raft of them. And then even when you kind of go layers down, there's just a whole community of young companies going into established areas that are trying to do something a little bit different. And honestly, the Spinoff is one of those. Like let's be real about it. And so I've always been interested in and attracted to that business community, but because I am fundamentally, unfortunately, I'm a journalist by training, I tend to try and temper that enthusiasm with a degree of skepticism and try and keep those things in tension. That's not something that Caffeine Daily is as interested in doing. I'm going to read you a quote from their About page, which I think is instructive about their intention. It says, "We are a champion of our community, working to celebrate and uplift our founders of today and inspire our founders of tomorrow." So that is not a news media type sentiment, but they are very open about being from and about the startup community rather than looking at it from a certain distance. And I think both James and Julie, I press them on this and they give pretty good answers. I think pretty coherent answers. The other thing is that it's a beautiful website. I recommend you check it out. It's caffeinedaily.co. So it's nicely designed. It's really performative. But it also has a very intelligent sort of sense of how it does become a community. It has a directory of startups that can be broken down into different areas. So you can it has the beginnings of a different kind of function than you would have in a typical sort of more news-focused website. It has news as its front page, but it has these other elements behind it too. It also has job listings, and so you can see that they have thought hard about where this thing will go. And while it might be that in its early days news drives a large share of the traffic, the fact that it has this kind of networking function to it is clearly part of the business thinking, and we sort of get to that. So look, I really enjoyed this conversation. I think you have to admire what Previously Unavailable has done. Previously Unavailable, for those who don't know, is James Hurman's consultancy startup. It has become a real go-to in terms of how you kind of sharpen the idea, the presentation, help with the sort of capital raising side of startups, and has ended up being a shareholder in a bunch of them. And we explore how that tension works as well. But it's produced, a company like Tracksuit or Ideally, which have become the hottest names in New Zealand startup community lately. So they very much know this area. And then Julie Gill, for her part, worked for a long time at NZ Tech, has a background in publishing, And so the two of them come into this with a large relationship of trust with that community. Yeah, I think the startup community in New Zealand, I talk about this, I think they can be super thin-skinned. I think they can be sort of almost allergic to criticism or scrutiny at times. And Caffeine Daily is very open about that not being its intention, but I think that they make the case for there being different ways that you can tease out the stories which will ultimately help make more companies, make the companies we have more successful. So yeah, it's a really fun chat with the pair of them. I think that they've done a lot of really smart product thinking with this that anyone in media could probably stand to think about a little bit more. So this is James Hurman and Julie Gill from Caffeine Daily on The Fold. Tēnā korua, welcome to The Fold.
Thanks, Duncan.
Thanks, Duncan.
I was wondering if you could start with just give me the genesis of the idea and the kind of elevator pitch for what Caffeine Daily is.
You want to do that, or shall I?
You go first.
Okay, I'll go first. So Caffeine is a daily content and community platform for the startup ecosystem in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and really our kind of mission is to better join up the amazing ecosystem that we've developed in startup over the last 10 years and really bring into the light what's happening in that community, who's doing what and what they're learning, importantly, so that we can better kind of network the founders and the other members of that ecosystem and really importantly share what they're learning about how to do the really difficult thing, which is to start and grow and build a really valuable company.
Yeah, and I think to James's point, we recognise that it's a tough job. It's a tough job and it's a busy job. So we are razor focused on the founders and how we can help them connect with each other, connect with the ecosystem, and also, as James says, that really sharing with them through the storytelling learnings on how if they're looking to start out, whether they're looking to grow or whether they're looking to scale internationally.
And in terms of its like ownership structure and its relationship to previously unavailable, which is the sort of this thing that seems to quite regularly now birth new businesses out of it. Do you want to talk a little bit about that piece?
Sure, yeah. It's a joint venture between Previously Unavailable and Julie. So yeah, I guess we are... Previously Unavailable is really in the business of new things. That's why we're called Previously Unavailable. We like stuff that didn't exist before. And so a big part of what we're involved with is the startup community. And a big part of our, I guess, mission is to make that community better and stronger. And so we see something like caffeine as a really important part of that journey, right? And a really important part of our future success and the future success of everyone who's involved in startup and the startup ecosystem in New Zealand. So it's kind of it's kind of something that I guess we have a lot of heart for, but also makes strategic sense for us to be kind of involved with over time.
Do you consider it a sort of a media property in the all of the senses of that word, or like? Because some of what you're doing sounds very much like media and some of it sounds more almost in an educational kind of space. Yeah, where does it sit for you?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question because I think, what is media nowadays?
It's like I asked that question a lot on this podcast.
Exactly.
Still not sure.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's the case. We're in a new world and we're in a new way of doing things. So I think from our perspective, what we recognise is that storytelling is the best way to share information and also make it interesting and useful and also for us, for startups, because they are so busy, we've looked at it and say, how can we create content that's actually in their workflow and so that it becomes, useful and regular. So that's why I think when James summarised, around us being content, news and a community platform, we are looking at, there is a lot of good stuff going on out there in New Zealand. So we don't want to be reinventing the wheel. We want to partner, where it works. We want to amplify good stuff going on, aggregate and signpost. And then if we can bring in some new ways of, storytelling and thinking, then we're adding that little bit of a sprinkle on top, really.
I think it's interesting because we've come together as someone in Julie who's got decades of experience as a publisher, so really understands media, and me who has zero experience in the space whatsoever. And it's kind of, it's like I'm really comfortable actually with the ambiguity around what it is. There's a lot of ambiguity, I think, around our business previously unavailable. We're quite hard to define and categorize. And I don't mind that as long as we're being useful, right? And it's a bit the same with caffeine. If we're being really useful to the community, really useful, particularly to founders, then you can call it a media platform or you can call it whatever you want, really. But I think it's, its main focus is to be really useful.
In terms of there's you've got one sort of slippery term which is media in 2023, and another which is startup. Like how long do you get to be a startup for, and where does that sort of begin and end in terms of is it, not all new businesses are startups? How do you sort of define it for your purposes, and how do you kind of think about the sort of bounds of what it is you're working on or with?
Yeah.
I think so. And also, it was probably the first thing that James and I discussed when we came together. The first whiteboarding was, what's the definition of a startup? That's where it probably started. So, yeah, James can probably go and I can add a bit.
Yeah. I think a startup is an early stage company that's built around a genuinely innovative or novel new technology or idea with a goal to grow very quickly into a large, valuable organization. And, usually companies like that are venture-backed, but not always. Usually they're in their first few years, but not always. And they tend to be also founder-led. So they're led by a group of people that came up with the idea and are sort of nurturing it and building it through to fruition. So that's generally how we kind of think about it. There's always sort of outliers to that. There are some companies that are startups but aren't venture-backed, or they are startups but something's happened to the founding team and so they're no longer founder-led. And so I guess there's a degree of latitude that we give ourselves in terms of defining it in very hard terms. But those are the sorts of things. Innovative company looking to grow really quickly.
Yeah. And also from in terms of our target audience, we are looking as well at, I suppose inspiring the next generation as well. So we are looking at how do we get them to think about becoming a startup and, either not necessarily being the founder, but maybe working for startups as well. So showcasing, what a startup is like. And also to James' point, in terms of, what is that definition? Because, if you're going off internationally, you could be 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 years and you're still a startup. So I think it's down to that fact where you're still growing and potentially you're still getting investment.
I mean, on some level, and you kind of alluded to this in part about this idea of things that don't currently exist. A startup can also be read as a critique of the existing environment or reality in a particular space. Like, what is your take on the existing business media, which tends to cover startups as a subset of what they do? Some have more emphasis on them than others, but obviously for you to believe that caffeine has a space to occupy, you've got to think that there are things that they're missing. What is that?
Yeah, well, I think that, we do outline this in our manifesto, which is that we believe that a lot of the media is reporting on the industry, and on companies, where I think we feel with caffeine that we're reporting like with the startup community and about them and helping them connect with each other or helping them, collaborate or learn from each other, where, I suppose currently a lot of the business media is more reporting on the industry.
And part of that, the business media would say, and news media more broadly would say, is that distance is important, that they would say that it allows them to report without fear or favour, to hold power to account, all of those kind of sort of bedrock assumptions. I think that the design and the look, the feel, the concept of Caffeine Daily is very compelling, but it does feel very close to the community, almost to the point where will all those lessons be able to be teased out if you're sort of so close that these personal relationships might require saying something that someone kind of finds a bit difficult to hear?
Yeah, I think it's a good question, and I think that was definitely part of our goal and our mission was to bring on what we deem is probably one of the most esteemed editorial business people in New Zealand, which is Fiona Rotherham, because I think bringing on, a fantastic editorial team that understands, how to write that absolute independent content. And I think that was key in there. And we've already seen, Duncan, already, people have been very open with us. The stories that we're writing, it's raw, it's out there, it's real. And I think that, absolutely it is about, it's not always roses in the startup world, and it is a tough place. So I think that, the stories to date have been very open and, and very real.
I mean, we saw just this week with, I think last time I saw you, James, was at the Icehouse Ventures capital raise. We saw Supi on stage trying to raise, and this week we saw a pretty dramatic collapse. How will you approach a story like that? And it's the kind of thing where because of your networks, you might well get wind of that coming ahead of time. Would you break that story? Like, how do you deal with someone who's been a real shining light, taking on absolute, probably next to banking, one of the hardest sectors in the country, and it falls apart? How does that versus that sort of champion of the community, celebrate and uplift? How do you deal with an event like that?
Well, this is one of the most important strands of what Caffeine is trying to do is about how we approach failure, right? So, firstly, I'd start by just acknowledging Sarah and her team, and she was brave enough to take on, the duopoly. She was brave enough to put a lot personally at stake to do that. And she made really amazing ground in the time that Supi existed. And the value of what she did was that we are now many steps closer to understanding how in future we can take on that duopoly and we can make things fairer for New Zealanders in the grocery sector. And the way that we need to view Sarah is by saying we've now got this amazingly valuable, experienced person that we need to absolutely wrap our arms around and invite back into the industry as soon as she's ready to help others kind of take those next steps. With Caffeine, the difference between our reporting on Supi and, say, the New Zealand Herald's reporting on Supi is going back to what Julie was saying. The New Zealand Herald is reporting to the public, right? So they are beholden to inform the public about what's going on. Our audience is founders, right? And so the question that we're asking is what's important to them? What do they need to know to build better companies more quickly, right? And so our kind of, we would publish on something like Supi if it was in the interests of founders and there's something that they could learn from it. Now, right now, it's not in the interests of founders. They already know what's happened to Supi. That's been widely reported. When we come back around and we say, what can we learn from this? What has Sarah learned from this? What have others in the business learned from this? That can be instructive to other founders. That is the kind of value that we'd be trying to extract. And so to make sure that, both that our community of founders learn from what Sarah learned, but also so that we begin to change our relationship with failure so that it's seen as a really important stepping stone to success and something which should be valued in that way.
It's funny, right? Because within startups, that's almost like gospel, this idea that failure needs to be recategorized, almost to the point sometimes I feel like it's celebrated as something unto itself rather than, well, actually, it's really the opposite of what you set out to do.
Yeah.
And sometimes, I've written a little bit about the startup community over the years, and certain people, well, there's a whole spectrum of people within it. I'm not suggesting you sit at one end of that or the other, but there can be a sense that it is very thin-skinned and it finds scrutiny or criticism or the idea of anyone being anything but an enthusiastic cheerleader for it. They don't, it's almost like a distance or complete lack of understanding of what the function of media is. You know, are you deliberately in that sort of that champion space, or do you think that there is sometimes something to be gained from a kind of a more skeptical scrutiny of, you know, whether it's the motives of venture capitalists, or, you know, whether this idea really was tested fully before it got up and tried to run? You know, like, I guess that I'm really curious about how you manage that space.
It's a really interesting question, because if we applied the same level of and I don't want to say scrutiny, because what you mean was this idea tested well enough. So if we applied the same level of process to a startup as we do to a traditional organization, we would almost never create any startups, right? And so there's a startup is all about finding a way to solve a problem in a completely new way that hasn't been proven before. Whereas if you're starting a traditional business, there's usually some kind of playbook, or there are people to learn from. There's due diligence to be done about how you might run that business. And startup, it's really different. You're figuring it out as you go along. And the reality is, if we're going to break new ground, if we're going to discover new ways of doing things, if we're going to create new value, it's really impossible to predict that and sort of follow a step-by-step best practice process to kind of get there. And so I think should those questions be asked? Absolutely, they should be asked, but within the understanding that we're reliant on people to put an awful lot at stake personally, as these founders do, or put that on the line in the interests of moving us all forward a little bit. So I think it's fair to judge it slightly differently than traditional business, where there is that playbook and they should be accountable to sort of tradition or best practice in a different sort of a way. So I think we, going back to your question, are we sort of at that end of sort of celebrating and championing? I mean, yes, we are, because again, our audience is founders, and we're there to kind of help them by sharing the knowledge of the community, as opposed to holding them to account in the interests of the general public. That's for others to do. They should be doing that. That's all good. But I think sometimes they should also be doing that with a sense of empathy for just how much a founder puts on the line.
Yeah, and I think to James's point, we definitely, and if you've had a chance to read some of the stories, we definitely have had people really open up about, where they feel they did make mistakes or roads they would have gone down differently. And I think that we do hope we can create that safe space that they can open, because we do want them to open up, because the only way everybody else is going to learn is if people are really open about what they feel they may have done differently. I mean, we've already started conversations about a series with with second founders. So some companies now like going in, and so what would they do differently? And I think that's also a really interesting space as well, because some of these companies, they've done really well, some of them they didn't, and there's a real interesting mix in there of and I think those type of things are really, really key for the audience.
Do you feel like we're thin-skinned?
Yeah.
No, I do think that the startup community is incredibly thin-skinned. Yeah, I remember, and this is obviously a tense and charged topic, but I remember in the aftermath of Jake Miller's death, it was an awful thing to happen, but there was a lot of negative energy directed towards the media as if it was somehow culpable in it, and there was this sort of idea that that scrutiny or anything but enthusiastic championing was somehow a betrayal or a misunderstanding of what startups do. Whereas, I'm a founder myself, and I really believe in I think that most of my favorite or the New Zealand companies I find most inspiring and interesting have been startups. But I also think that the idea that a particular business community should be immune from the kind of criticism that is regularly applied to corporates. Obviously, I totally agree with what you said about that there should be a different kind of a standard, but I think that actually it would really benefit the startup community if it was more comfortable having the same kind of scrutiny applied, because it ultimately makes you better, I think. Yeah. Even if, a certain story coming out at a particular time within a raise might be inconvenient, like ultimately is the information correct? That's the same. That's the measure that media has to apply.
I think the other thing is, like in the case of Jake and Sarah as well, I think we are dealing with people who are pretty young, right? I think when the business media approaches business in a conventional sense, you're probably dealing with a pretty experienced CEO and a pretty experienced board. In a traditional business where those people absolutely should know what they're doing, and they're invested in by people who are making pretty low-risk investments, right, that they expect a return from. And so holding those people accountable, I think is what am I trying to say? The startup founders should be held accountable in a slightly different way, because investors go into those businesses knowing they're extremely high risk, right? So they're taking a punt. And those people are often very young people who are trying to find the path forward, as opposed to people who ought to know how to do this and follow kind of best practice in doing that. So I think the standard does need to be a little bit different, although I do agree with you that it's useful to have eyes looking in on those businesses and asking, are they doing what they ought to be doing, or should they have done things differently, or those sorts of things. And so I guess we're agreeing on the main point.
Yeah, look, I totally take your point there. I think I look at a company like Crimson, for example, which has, is considered a real shining light, has a very young founder, also has a board and an investor set, which is, made up of some very experienced people. And that company has been around quite a long time now, but still at times can feel like it resents or views as hostile what are fairly routine lines of inquiry, especially given that, yes, it's a young company, but it's also acquired a lot of established companies that have been incorporated into it. But I think that, but I basically sort of tend to agree that you've made your point pretty well. It's a matter of figuring out where at what point it opens up to a next round of criticism. But I've got to say, Fiona Rotherham is an extraordinary hire, one of the best business journalists in the country. And if you're ever going to have someone well placed to navigate that sort of slightly tricky, those tricky waters, I would really back her to do it. And I think even just as a marker about your intention, you could have hired a lot of different people, but you hired her. Yeah. So we'll have one more tricky question.
No, these are great. That's right. And I sort of feel like we'd love to sit all day and actually chat.
That's good. Apply scrutiny, please, Duncan.
Well, I mean, but because there's a lot that I think is just so clever and interesting about the way you set this up, and I want to dig into that. But the last sort of tricky one I want to get into is the relationship with Previously Unavailable, because you're a consultancy, because you are, as a company, as I understand it, a shareholder in a number of different startups, have a relationship with a bunch more. How do you handle the church-state sort of separation of not appearing to or sort of almost accidentally favouring companies with which you have a relationship on a platform that, if it is to be successful, has to be as neutral as it can? Notwithstanding the fact that it's very hard to do that, even at hyperscale, New York Times doesn't report as well on itself as it does on the Washington Post.
Yeah. Do you want me to go, or you go? Well, I suppose it's the previous question.
Well, no, but I think, I'm probably more curious about how you handle it. Yeah. James might be champing at the bit to get his ministers in there. Someone's got to hold the line. Yeah.
Well, I think there's probably three areas for me. I think the first area was that for me with James and Previously, that we jointly had the same passion for this. We saw the gap in the market, but we also didn't go into this for the short term. As James said, I've been around in publishing for a long time, and we both looked at this as like a real long-term play. We said, how do we build a brand that's around in 20 years' time, and a brand that the next generation kind of grow up, connecting to. And also we looked at this knowing the type of landscape, that we were almost sort of saying, okay, well, how do we ensure that it also has that neutral ground? And I think that's why the hire was someone like Fiona, and I've worked with Fiona for 7 or 8 years, and I know that church and state as well, and that's the bit that where we work really, really well together. And I think that was the key thing when we talked about this. This business will be absolutely, separate to anything. However, it's brilliant that previously are in that network, understand what's going on, and have great companies and great connections, and also can support the business through understanding what's going on in the ecosystem. So for us, it was a beautiful pairing, really.
And I think it's a really fair question, right? Do we have, as previously, any influence over caffeine? And I guess I'm learning as someone who is new to this, sort of how to navigate that in the best possible way. I think, what I've definitely learnt about Fiona is she's not at all afraid to say no to anyone around her, no matter how influential, which is a really good thing, and is one of the reasons that we put her in that role. And also, I mean, for us, really from a PR perspective, the companies that we're involved with, the caffeine is not the sort of the thing that's going to really fuel them, right? A better ecosystem here in New Zealand absolutely is. And so it's my kind of firm belief that if we improve the quality of the ecosystem and the connections within it and the knowledge sharing across it, our companies will do well, everyone else's companies will do well, the country will do well, and the companies that we are invested in and support will do better than if we were to favour them on caffeine, which would, to be honest, not get them any particularly further than where they would otherwise.
Let's switch tack to talk about the sort of underlying business model of caffeine. What are the kind of core current and sort of imagined revenue streams for it?
Yeah. So I think for us at the moment, we're obviously, believe it or not, 8 weeks in the market, as of yesterday. And so from our perspective, we know there's going to be opportunities for multi-platform commercial models, around, whether there's events and podcasts, etc. So the content is obviously what we'll kind of wrap the commercial side around. But currently it's pretty much sponsorship, advertising and events. And also, as media partners, so people are obviously partnering with us for us to be their media partner to promote their events and write some stories, etc. So we've started off really just pretty straightforward at the moment, and we've been very much open to ideas, which has been great actually, because people have come along with really, really good idea. We have made it pretty clear from day one that the editorial is independent, and if there is going to be like a podcast series or a story series, it would be very clearly defined, brought to you by. But yeah, people are coming up with really, really good ideas. And of course, it's not just about the stories in caffeine. We've got the entire ecosystem directory, which is, is a really equal part of this. The stories is obviously the part of the engaging and the learning, but we also want to be able to do all the signposting. And that includes then, bringing in the entire ecosystem, around caffeine. So at the presently, we've got the sort of job listing, I suppose reaching out. We've got all the events listing on there, and we've now got, the startups starting to put their profiles on. We've got investors and service providers. So, there's revenue models around that as well in terms of people. So
one really important part of it so far has been like how passionate others in the ecosystem have been and have come forward and supported us financially and also in other ways, because they share that belief that this is a really important part of New Zealand's future, right? They share the belief that in the future we need to, a part of our economy needs to be technology companies and other idea-led novel innovation companies that can grow and export globally and bring value back to New Zealand. So there are lots of people who, they understand that future and they understand what's in it for them, and they've come to us and provided support because of that. And of course, we need them to continue to do that and for others to do that. And so I don't know if it's okay to encourage anyone out there who kind of believes in this mission like we do, because we certainly, as it costs money to do these things, and any support that we can get is gratefully received.
And I think the way we've structured it as a model at the moment, we've got the 5 sections. So we've got your talent, you've got your resource, you've got your investment, and you've got your connect. And so in there, we've got a very wide-reaching, community who really want to support us and sort of see this information come to light. As James said, we've been absolutely blown away, because we spent 3 months in the market before we launched, and it was amazing, to push through an open door, which is pretty rare nowadays. And in my past experience, I never had before. So it's been a very nice experience.
Yeah, I mean, I do want to get to how the sort of community is received. But before then, can you drill in a bit? Because one of the things that I think is most interesting and clever about the way that you've launched is that it uses storytelling as a component of what you're doing, but it's not the whole of what the platform provides. And if you think about what the historical revenue models of newspapers were, classifieds were a huge part of it before Trade Me arrived. But that sort of jobs, events, directory, you've got elements of a sort of a white pages kind of, or a yellow pages, 2.0 thing there. You've got a bit of Seek, that there is an understanding that when you're thinking about what this thing can be, that it can have these extra components. Just talk me through maybe in a bit more detail about what the sort of the function of those elements is, and about how those might ultimately become sort of revenue streams unto themselves, if you have that
sort of vision,
figured out.
Yeah, I mean, I think, to be honest, when we started, and again, as to say, because we really went out to the whole ecosystem, not just the startup ecosystem, we talked to all the government agencies, we talked to many corporates, a lot of the service providers, angels, etc., in terms of how they were trying to connect with the startup ecosystem. But I think primarily we always just keep going back to what do the startups want from caffeine. So from our perspective, we've definitely held our powder dry on what we kind of come out with, because we wanted to be at least 2 or 3 months out in the market, and our plan is that really once a month we want to get startups into the office and really constantly talk about what they want and develop it for them. But what we definitely are hearing is that if we can become that aggregator, so that it's, because right now it's really hard to navigate up and down the country if you're a founder trying to find things. There's regional, components going on. There's national. There's lots of people doing lots of things. So I think we recognise that we can be that aggregator and bring everyone together, but we don't need to reinvent the wheel. And so we have been talking to, lots of, parties about how we do that. And that's probably around those 3 areas. That's around the whole talent space. That's around service providers, and that's around investment. So I think for us it's about collaboration, and with that becomes a commercial model.
Could you, for example, there are once you have an audience that is kind of very specific, like the one that you're gathering and seeking, is could capital raises happen on your platform? Like how vertically integrated do you want to go, and at what point does it start to go from we are a champion to we are competing with elements of the people that we're relating to?
Now you're giving us ideas.
Well, we've talked about it in a more of a collaborative way with the investor community, not as a competitor.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that's a really interesting concept, because you run a capital raise through Caffeine's platform, and the answer is probably yes, but would it be as good as the process is when it's being run through a venture capital firm as the lead investor?
I guess the reason I ask is because a lot of the hard work of capital raises, at least as I've watched them happen, it's about telling the right people the right story about, and it's basically an information distribution problem in a lot of ways. And you are, if successful, going to solve elements of that. So it sort of lends itself to a lot of different adjacencies, I suppose.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think that's a really interesting thing, which I think we'll take away and think a little bit more about. But I think at the moment, because we've just been so focused on how do we take this first step, right? And how do we produce content that's useful and valuable? How do we start to learn about this as an audience and a media platform? We're so focused on that we're not thinking too far ahead in terms of what it might become in future. Certainly the functionality that's on there at the moment comes from that place of saying what's going to be most useful to founders. So, what do founders need? Well, they need staff, right? They're always growing and always employing. So jobs boards need to be a part of what we're doing. What do they need? They need funding, and so connections into that community are kind of important, and an understanding of how to interface with those investors and tell their story in the right way is important. And so those sort of other aspects of caffeine beyond the content are, again, just come from that place of what do founders need and how do we kind of put that around them and make it as easy as possible for them.
This previously is on a bit of a tear with it, with the sort of startups at its birth, Tracksuit, then Ideally. Now, Caffeine, with the previous two, they obviously have very large aspirations that are kind of baked into them. Caffeine Daily is very much about, as you said at the top, Aotearoa's startup community. It also has a .co domain name. Is this kind of intentionally kind of a sort of a set alongside the startup community, or is it a startup unto itself that you can imagine growing, scaling, potentially porting into different areas? What's the big dream out of it?
I think for us at the moment, we just feel there's quite a big job to be done in New Zealand. And I think even, just from in the last 6 months, because this the Genome report's been out, the Startup Council, has been all this kind of view, and there is such a job to do to connect our own ecosystem, and also connect it internationally. I don't think either of us would deny that, if we thought there was opportunities to develop this internationally, we're not going to look at it. But I'd say right now for us, we feel there's a big job to be done here in New Zealand, which is going to take us quite a few years. But we're always, I'd imagine, be interested in James' view on that. But
yeah, where our heart is, I think, is New Zealand, and where, what I guess we want the legacy of caffeine to be is that it really helped New Zealand become the best in the world at creating and scaling really valuable, innovative companies. And the difference between, say, Tracksuit or Ideally or AF Drinks or these other companies that we've been involved with, there is a very clear intention in those businesses to grow them as fast as possible, as big as possible, and sell them, right? That's absolutely the trajectory that those businesses are on and have been on since day one. And that's very clear and really transparent. Caffeine, not at all. So there's no sort of plan to grow it as big as possible, as fast as possible, and then sell it on. That's not the mission of this company. And as a joint venture partner, we don't look at it in the same way as we look at Ideally or Tracksuit. It's a really different thesis, right? And it's much more of a long-term play for us. And it's much more about, as I said before, kind of creating an environment in New Zealand in which those companies like Tracksuit and Ideally and AF grow even better than they already are. And so, I definitely view it very differently, equally important, but a really different kind of business.
And I think that's the same, and that's to add really, I think for me and Fiona, Fiona is so passionate about this space, and for her, this is just such an exciting opportunity for this, stage of her career. Same with myself, that we see this as this long-term play, and that's definitely, like I say, was the pairing with myself and James on how we can grow this and, do an amazing job for New Zealand. And so very excited about where it could go.
Well, 8 weeks old, and honestly, it's so impressive. We haven't even talked about the design and the actual wiring of the platform, because it's a beautiful product unto itself as well.
Well, thanks, Duncan.
Thank you.
But I feel like, when something's 8 weeks old, it needs a lot of attention. I'm sorry for drawing you away from it for now, but I really appreciate your time, and congratulations and good luck.
Brilliant, thanks.
Thanks so much, Duncan.